violence part is also an issue. And you know what? One of the most interesting moments for me was in any of the conversations we've had was actually that one that we had with Randall
Yeah.
Kennedy some time ago. That there was a moment in that that really threw me for a loop, which is that the truth simply is that, for example, in New York City, black men commit a vastly disproportionate number of homicides. And it is mostly of other black men, that's true. But the issue is not people tend to kill people of their own color. It doesn't just stop there. Yes, white people tend to kill white people, black people tend to kill black people, but black people kill proportionately many, 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 many more black people than white people or Asians or Latinos. It's a big gulf. I wonder why. We should be able to explain why there is that level of violence. And there was that time when I asked Randy, I said, why is it that when you read about a carjacking, you don't even have to wonder? You know it's in Milwaukee or something like that. You know that the names are going to be black names eventually. You know that nobody white, usually nobody Latino, and certainly nobody Asian did that. It's only black people who do that. Why? And the answer is not there's something wrong with black people, but I assumed that Randy, in all of his brilliance, because he's in criminology, he knows these things, I assumed that he would know, and even he didn't. And I'm not putting him down, it's just that I was really struck that he didn't have an answer, because I thought that's where it was going. And I'd like to know what the answer is, because of course Charles Murray, who you have spoken with, thinks that there is something inherently violent about black people, and that's what these numbers suggest. And he's not crazy to come to that
I don't think
conclusion
Charles
looking at
thinks
the
that.
numbers.
I mean, I don't know
But
where
if it
he,
isn't,
anyway, I should let you explain yourself.
what do you think the reason
Okay,
for this
well,
is?
then let's not talk about Charles Murray. No, I think he just thinks it's very important to take note of the fact that there's greater violence. I don't think he thinks, he may think it, but he hasn't said that there's something inherently wrong with black people.
Okay.
Yeah,
He just gives the numbers, right?
Well, I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, I can think of some possible explanations. Social structures like absent fathers and discipline of teenage boys, or like gang affiliation and the kinds of dispute resolution that turns to violence between gang members, where we'd have to look on the ground. Papachristos, Andrew Papachristos is his name, a sociologist at Northwestern University, has gotten famous for his detailed mapping of, these kind of spatial representations of who killed whom, drawing links between the two of them. And you see these clusters and you can just see them, the Four Trade Disciples and the Black Pea Stone Rangers in Chicago, are, rival gangs. And then the fact is that the gang leaders who might have been able to quell the disputes before they get out of hand get arrested and locked up. And then the gangs fragment into these smaller ganglets, of a few square blocks or whatever, that get into disputes with each other. And there's nobody up here who can call a truce or enforce the, informal rule of law that says, no, you don't go shoot that guy because the retaliation thing will spin out of control. And then the retaliation thing spins out of control. There's that. But I don't really know. I'm not going to pretend to having a handle on this. I mean, I will call attention to social media, as you often do, that permits us kind of a coordination of this thing. So these flash mob events that are happening, like in Chicago right now, North Avenue Beach in Chicago has become a place where hundreds upon thousands of young people, mostly black people, will gather. And some of the shooting incidents that have broken out there are happening because the event has happened. And the event is mediated by the ability of people to say, hey, we're going to hang out at 10 o'clock tonight at the whatever. Mayor of the city is talking about imposing curfews, and, downtown businessmen are going ballistic because nobody wants to come and eat in the restaurant because you can't get to your car after your meal without worrying that somebody's going to mess with you. And just the presence of these kids on the street, they're unruly, they're loud, they're irreverent, and often they're violent. There are muggings that take place. There are internal disputes that spill over and whatnot. But I'm rambling. You've asked a hard question. Why is the racial difference in violence so great? You could say culture. You would not have explained very much if you used that word. It's almost a tautology. Yes, they have values that are consistent with the expression of violent behavior, such as we are observing, but everyone behaves in a way that, in some sense, is a reflection of the values that they embrace. So you will have only relabeled the problem by calling attention to the cultural predicate.
It's obvious that in that world, violence is seen as less abnormal than among, for example, Bangladeshi immigrant teenagers, etc. And this is an important moment, because if you ask this question and then you give that answer, and this is especially for people who are watching us who are on the young side, to the extent that this is supposed to be at all educational. What you'll hear very often about Glenn and me, I think I see this said about myself probably daily. All you have to do is open up Twitter, is that we downplay racism and that that's some sort of sin, that we're not emphasizing it enough, with the implication that if we emphasized it more, we would be giving light to what the solution to everything is. We're downplaying racism, and that's like, downplaying how important oxygen is to life. No, we don't downplay racism. We're saying that racism is overplayed. And one of the reasons is, for all the people who you see out there who think that racism is everything and have whole careers based on writing about racism, think about what Glenn and I just talked about and explain, where is racism in all of that? Now, you can talk about history, but you can't go back and fix history. Is what we just talked about due to something called racism in any way that actually makes any sense, and that could actually be transformed into policy that would change things? And of course, maybe you can look at the reasons that these kids are doing these sorts of things now and call those things racism. You can play with language, but are you really convinced? If you read those people's arguments, are you really convinced? The simple fact is that racism does exist. It is important. But this level of violence that we're talking about, to say that that level of violence is due to racism, and even structural, it's due to structural racism. The question is how? Explain how. And you've got about 25 words. How is it due to structural racism? And you can see that that's just, it's a worthless way of looking at it. And so that is why Glenn and I downplay racism, because there's more to talk about than that when people are really suffering. Racism is not the answer to everything that ails Black people.
That's very well said. I think the fact that it doesn't lead to any policy intervention that can plausibly be taken as a solution to the problem at hand is key. I think it's exculpatory. I think people are trying to say, don't blame Black people for our plight. Racism, the system, structure is the source of responsibility for our plight. There's nothing wrong with Black people. Ibram X. Kendi tells you this every day. There's nothing wrong with Black people. If you say that the disparity is not due to racism, you're in effect saying there's something wrong with Black people. Well, of course, I don't think that's true. I don't think that follows. But if you can rest with racism, you will have taken the weight of responsibility off. Another thing I want to say with respect to the violence issue is, and I think my friend and colleague Bruce Western, the sociologist, your colleague at Columbia, would agree with this. Witnessing violent acts when you're young is traumatizing. So if you're in a community in which there's a high level of violence in the geographic, class, race, urban locale that you're situated in, there is gang warfare. There are a lot of guns. People are shooting each other. You're seeing people bleeding out, knife fights, bitter domestic disputes that end up in violent confrontation between partners, things of this kind. A lot of anger, a lot of loud voices shouting all the time. This kind of rough culture, an honorific masculinity where people have to defend their reputation for being willing to fight it. If you're in such an environment and you see this affects the neurological development, it affects the moral sensibility of the young person, and they become more susceptible themselves to being entrapped in that and reproducing that same kind of way of life. So that's another. And what makes all of that go is closure on the social networks in which people are embedded. The fact that there are clusters of people who are segregated, not just geographically, but also imaginatively. They don't see much outside of this little small world. and also in terms of their relationships, their connections to other people are closed. And so if something is amiss in that closed space, it tends to get reproduced across generations within that space and can be resulting in this outsized difference, which is order of magnitude in the relative frequency of violent acts.
And none of that is blaming people. I mean, as linguist, I'm always thinking, you speak the language you know. If that's all you knew, then how can you be blamed for falling into those patterns? But for somebody to look at that and cross their arms and say, I see racism, or for somebody to go, because of this conversation we're having, because we don't understand that racism is there. Think about how whack that is. It really isn't a constructive response. And I don't think, unlike I'm guessing with you, Glenn, I'm just guessing, but I don't think those people who are clicking their tongues and saying, I see racism, are acting. I don't think that it's a grift. But I think that they, in a way, have a hard time seeing beyond all that they've ever known. All that those people have ever known is a certain overeducated crowd who talk that language. And then you went to college and you took courses where you were versed further in that language. You might have even gotten an advanced degree where all anybody talks about is that, and where you're validated for doing that, and you never hear any other perspective. And you're taught that any other perspective is just somebody who's either ignorant or some kind of Uncle Tom. It's all you knew. That's all they know. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that they're always right. And the answer to what we're talking about is not, I see racism.